And now a quickie with Bill Maher.
I think liberals, they make a real effort not to understand the Trump voter. And, it's like, oh, DeSantis is going to be great because it's Trumpism without Trump. And I think they're like, why would we want a tribute band when the actual band is still playing? I read this other thing Trump said a couple of weeks ago where he said, they're not out to get me. They're out to get you. They're coming for you. They just got to get through me. That's what they like about him. He's a warrior. Agreed. I think.
And that was Bill Maher. Back in a minute. Good morning. It is Tuesday, March the 28th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have No Free Lunch, Stuart Varney, Inspector Lewis, Bill Maher, Velshi, The Rape of the Mind, Emotional Manipulation, and George-Lakoff. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain standing and remove your hats for the national anthem of the United States of America.
Thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
The most manifest characteristic of human beings is their diversity. The freer an economy is, the more this human diversity of knowledge will be manifested. By contrast, political power originates in top-down processes. Governments, monopolies, regulators, and elite institutions all attempting to quell human diversity and impose order. Thus, power always seeks centralization. George Gilder. Human beings have diverse experiences, perspectives, talents, and priorities. Modernity claims to celebrate diversity, and yet what most unleashes the glory of human diversity is freedom. Social organization from the top squashes this diversity, and worse, no one seems to appreciate the irony.
And that was No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. There was another mass murder yesterday in, I guess it was Memphis, Tennessee, at a private Christian school. And what is important about this, again, if you're going to be a true conservative, you've got to get the vocabulary, the language correct. One of the ways that the left dominates this country is through these little sleights of hand. They alter the language just a little bit. And you don't notice at first. You're thinking it may go right over your head. In this particular case, what they do is they call it a mass shooting. The emphasis is always, when a gun is involved, on shooting. It's a mass shooting, a mass shooting, a mass shooting. The shooter. They want to make sure they emphasize that because that's what gives them a springboard to go right into gun control. And what we really need is crime control. As a conservative, we can't win arguments that start off as being about mass shootings. Can't win that argument. That leads straight to gun control. Okay, if you want to, and what we should be talking about is crime control. So the way that we get to a crime control, looking at crime control solutions, is by starting with mass murder. That's what happened yesterday. Mass murder. 4 or 5 people were murdered, killed. And you have to remember that. If you want to be a true conservative, you have to understand that. You don't win by magic. You win by knowing what you're doing and knowing what you're talking about. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now an advertisement actually from Squawk Box for a new MSNBC talk show host.
There are 2 pillars to this job as a journalist. The first is to bear witness to what's happening. The second is to hold power to account. We've got a power gap, a wealth gap, and more than ever, a communications gap. My work is to facilitate a dialogue. All of us are better off when we're around people with different backgrounds and perspectives. And the only way we effectively speak truth to power is by truly understanding all sides of an argument.
So this Velshi is the name of this guy who's a new MSNBC talk show host. And when you're listening to that, what is he doing but putting out all kinds of arbitrary claims? He's trying to trigger you into proving a negative. He says that there's 2 pillars to journalism. Says who? Says Velshi? Well, why should I listen to him? Even if he is an authority, where did he get this information? Did he do a study? Did he do research? Second is that how he describes those 2 pillars. One, he says, is being a witness to events. Now, that sounds familiar. That's what I understand journalism to be. They are people that go out, they hear that there's something has happened, let's say an automobile accident, they go out to the scene, and they report. They're not journalists, really. They are reporters. Okay, so they go out and they report. Now, that's why he uses journalism, by the way, and not reporter, because he can't say there's 2 pillars to being a reporter. There isn't. There's only one. So, and the second one is to talk truth to power. Really, how do you figure, Mr. Velshi? Where did you get this idea? From Columbia Journalism School? Did you make it up on your own? Have you done research? Have you done studies? Have you done polls or surveys? So where did you get this information? No answer. It's an arbitrary claim. It can, it should, it must be ignored. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of Stuart Varney and his guest.
The president's trying to sell voters on his economic record. I think that's going to be a tough sell, Steve. Take us through it.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Stuart. And, look, the economy isn't terrible. The numbers are almost worse than the real economy. I mean, we do have a good jobs market right now, no question about it. But, Americans just aren't buying whatever it is that Joe Biden is selling. That number, by the way, that you put up on the screen a few minutes ago, about only 20% of Americans rate the economy as good or great, those are almost flip opposite of where they were 2 or 3 or 4 years ago under Trump, when, 2/3 of Americans thought the economy was good or great.
So that's hogwash. Again, the statistics only report on themselves, on the people surveyed. So what they should have said was, of those surveyed, 20% think the economy is going well. And then 4 years ago, of those surveyed, 60% thought the economy was going well. That's the way to properly report statistics, especially if you're going to be, quote unquote, neutral about it. Now, the question then is, and this is a technique that the left came up with. It's very subtle. It's a very subtle way, but it puts psychological pressure on people, right? So if you're a Biden supporter and he comes on and says only 20% of Americans think this is a great economy, that puts a lot of pressure on you. You feel compelled to explain and justify and whatnot. But if I come out and I say 20% of those surveyed, 2,000 people were surveyed, and 20% of them, which would be 400 people, say, that's no big deal. You shrug that off, right? Shrug it off and you move on. That's the point of trying to claim that these polls and surveys represent people that they don't actually represent. It's power. Now, the Democrats started doing that. Now the Republicans are doing it. Why are the Republicans doing something they know or should know to be wrong? Simple. There's an idiom called that goes, if you can't beat them, join them. But the problem with that is that we can beat them, that we can beat the Democrats. It just requires a little bit of thought. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit more of the all-new Don't Think of an Elephant by George-Lakoff.
Poverty. Poverty is a freedom issue. It is obvious. People who are poor have a lot less freedom than people who are rich. As we have seen, people who are poor have less access to health care and education than people who are rich. But there are many more freedoms eroded or altogether lost due to poverty. Housing is better for the rich than the poor. There is no homelessness among the rich. Neighborhoods are better for the rich than the poor. The ability to relocate or travel is far easier for the rich than the poor. Food is better for the rich than the poor. Social connections are better for the rich than the poor. Better jobs are available for the rich than the poor. All of these are freedom issues. If you are homeless or cannot find a decent place to live for yourself and your family, you are oppressed and limited. You are not free. If you cannot relocate or travel when you need to or want to, you are limited in your freedom. If you cannot eat properly, you are not free. If you are not able to connect with people, you are not free. If you are not free to find a job and work, you are not free. In virtually every dimension of life, being in poverty without being able to escape it is a freedom issue. Yet many people in poverty often vote for measures that make their lives worse, not better, because continual conservative framing has activated a conservative worldview even in those whose lives could be essentially ruined by it. Conservatives see being poor as a personal failure, a failure of individual responsibility. But the reality is that poverty curtails freedom. There is a reason why people speak of being trapped in poverty. They are. Again, in our democracy, the private depends on the public. Do we care about whether our fellow citizens are free or not? Discrimination. Race.
And I'm going to go ahead and stop it there at with poverty. And so what he's doing here, again, is using freedom as a metaphor and then suggesting that poverty forces people to be unfree or that they're oppressed. He actually used the word oppressed. This goes along the lines of Karl Marx, goes all the way back to Karl Marx, who said, what good is freedom to a man who is hungry or who has nothing to eat? And it's a complete non sequitur. It just doesn't follow. So how do you deal with this? If somebody comes to you and they say, oh, well, but poverty forces people or is a freedom issue, you say, no, it isn't. And you tell them there's no law forcing anybody to be poor. There's no law forcing anybody to stay poor. There's no law preventing anybody from becoming rich. That's the way you handle that. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the next 3 of the 30 covert emotional manipulation tactics by Adelyn-burch.
25. Creating fear. What many of these manipulation tactics have in common is that they make the victim feel fear. Namely, the fear of losing the manipulator in the relationship. We don't want to lose them, so we act in the way they want us to act in order to avoid that loss. In this situation, it's convenient that the person who created our fear is the only one who can relieve our fear. So we unwittingly end up giving them all the power in the relationship. Creating fear is a powerful way to gain control. Politicians do it all the time. They create or exaggerate a potentially dangerous problem, and then tell you that if you vote for them, they'll protect you from it. 26. The pity play. I'm sure that if the devil existed, he would want us to feel very sorry for him. Martha Stout, author of The Sociopath Next Door. Using this tactic, the manipulator will inspire your pity by making themselves look like the victim of circumstance or of some unfair person or organization. This elicits your sympathy and your cooperation, because as a person with a conscience, you can't stand to see someone else suffering. Manipulators know how to take advantage of our conscience. Using the pity play tactic, the manipulator will tell you a sad story that tugs upon your heartstrings. They might tell you they were unfairly fired from their job and need money to pay the bills, or that they've been unfairly evicted by their crazy landlord and need a place to stay, only until they find a new apartment. Oh, and the landlord kept their security deposit, so they'll need to save money for another one and won't be able to help you with living expenses. The pity play can be much more subtle. If you find out your new love interest is married but didn't say so, he or she will tell you a heartbreaking story of their spouse's emotional neglect and the terrible loneliness they've endured because of it. They'll say that they only stayed in the marriage because they never imagined they would meet someone else, especially someone as wonderful as you. One crafty manipulator hung his head and said, "I gave up. I put my heart on a shelf. I never dreamed I'd fall in love again. And now, here you are. I should have told you I was married, but I was so scared I'd lose you." Not a word of it was true, but it worked. She felt so sorry for this poor, lonely, and hopeless man who had given up on life, until she came along. 27. Rationalization. This is also known as justification or excuse-making. The manipulator creates reasons for their bad behavior that sound logical and rational in order to make their actions more understandable, acceptable, or appropriate. They do this to get you off their back so they can continue doing what they feel like doing. Every man watches porn. It's not just me. What I did wasn't illegal. If it were, there would be a law against it, right? I'm sorry I hit you. I just lost my mind for a minute. Because you push so many of my buttons. When you trust someone and want to think the best of them, you strive to understand their behavior. Manipulators are happy to help you do that.
And that was the next 3 of the 30 Covert Emotional Tactics from the book 30 Covert Emotional Tactics by Adelyn-burch. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
Chapter 4. Why did they yield? The psychodynamics of false confession. Is there a bridge from the concept of Pavlovian conditioning to deeper psychological understanding? Only in those Pavlovian theoreticians who deny modern depth psychology does there exist a conflict between concepts. Pavlov himself acknowledged the presence of deeper, hidden motivations in man and the limitations of his study of animal behavior. Our task is to go back to the brainwashee, asking ourselves, how can we better convey an understanding of what happened to him? What were the Pavlovian circumstances, and what were the inner motivations to yield to enforced political manipulation of the mind? Was it cowardice? Was it a prison psychosis? Was it the general loss of mental stamina in our world? In the following observations and experiences, I hope to make use of the clinical insight actually provided by modern depth psychology. The upset philosopher. One day in 1672, a lonely philosopher of reason, Spinoza, had to be forcibly restrained by his friends and neighbors. He wanted to rush out into the streets and shout his indignation at the mob which had murdered his good friend Jan de Witt, a noble statesman of the Dutch Republic, who had been falsely accused of treason. But presently, he calmed down and retreated to his room where, as usual, he ground optical lenses according to a daily and hitherto unbroken routine. As he worked, he thought back to his own behavior, which had been no more rational or sensible than the behavior of the rioting crowd which had killed de Witt. It was then that Spinoza realized the existence of the emotional beast hidden beneath human reason, which, when aroused, can act in a wanton and destructive fashion and can conjure up thousands of justifications and excuses for its behavior. For, as Spinoza sensed, and as the great psychologist Sigmund Freud later demonstrated, people are not the rational creatures they think they are. In the unconscious, that vast storehouse of deeply buried memories, emotions, and strivings, lie many infantile and irrational yearnings, which constantly influence the conscious acts. All of us are governed to some degree by this hidden tyrant and by the conflict between our reason and our emotions. To the extent that we are victims of unchecked unconscious drives, to that extent we may be vulnerable to mental manipulation. And although there is a horrifying fascination in the idea that our mental resistance is relatively weak, that the very quality which distinguishes one man from another, the individual I, can be profoundly altered by psychological pressures. Such transformations are merely extremes of a process we find operating in normal life. Through systemized suggestion, subtle propaganda, and more overt mass hypnosis, the human mind, in its expressions, is changed daily in any society. Advertising seduces the democratic citizen into using quackeries or one special brand of soap instead of another. Our wish to buy things is continually stimulated. Campaigning politicians seek to influence us by their glamour as well as by their programs. Fashion experts hypnotize us into periodic changes of our standards of beauty and good taste. In cases of menticide, however, this assault on the integrity of the human mind is more direct and premeditated. By playing on the irrational child lying hidden in the unconscious, And by sharpening the internal conflict between reason and emotion, the inquisitor can bring his victims to abject surrender. All of the victims of deliberate menticide, the POWs in Korea, the imprisoned traitors to the dictatorial regimes in the Iron Curtain countries, the victims of Nazi terror during the Second World War, are people whose way of life had been suddenly and dramatically altered. They'd been torn from their homes, their families, their friends, and thrown into a frightening abnormal atmosphere. The very strangeness of their surroundings made them more vulnerable to any attack on their values and attitudes. When the dictator exploits his victims' psychological needs in a threatening, hostile, and unfamiliar world, breakdown is almost sure to follow.
And that was The Upset Philosopher from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-Meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. And so now I've got I'm going to take this a little bit of a different approach, and I think it's going to be a much better approach in this podcast. Instead of dealing with, very often I'm making comments about people that are talking to a television camera, whether it's Sean Hannity or Mark Kay or whoever it happens to be. It's much easier and much better to be able to play a clip of a conversation, or at least part of a conversation, so that you can get the idea and understand, because you and I are not going to end up talking to Sean Hannity, so, or any of his guests. So a lot of what he's saying or talking about is rather, superfluous, irrelevant. But this is from a program called Inspector Lewis. It's a British program. It's a detective show. And there's several examples in this episode of Inspector Lewis. It's called The Indelible Stain, in case you want to look it up. But in the beginning here, it's an American professor that's in England, in Oxford, to give a little bit of a talk about criminal justice. So let me go ahead and play the clip, and we'll go from there.
That would be extremely helpful. Yes. Nina Clemens, second year law. Given that past theories of dangerousness have tended to target ethnic communities where poverty and crime rates are highest, isn't your proposal just the latest Trojan horse by which to introduce racially motivated social engineering?
So, right there. So what this is about, he's giving a talk where he's talking about, the human genome is being mapped. And so that gives the opportunity to try and figure out who has a propensity towards crime. And if we can find out, of course, who has propensity towards crime, then maybe we can reduce the crime rate. So then this girl stands up, because this is the question and answer period, to basically confront him. And if you listen to her, she makes an arbitrary claim, about studies have shown that your way of doing things goes primarily against minorities. And isn't this just another way of doing racial engineering? She's basically trying to call him a racist, and this is what the left always does. They won't call you a racist flat out. Because that implies knowledge, certainty of knowledge, and they refuse to acknowledge that. So what they'll do instead is they hint, and that's what she's doing, hinting and suggesting and hoping that he's going to react in such a way as to confirm what it is that she suspects. And she's also letting everybody else know, hey, everybody in the room, you should suspect this guy of being basically a racist. So this is the kind of thing you're going to find in a day-to-day situation. You might be talking about something that sounds up some promising bit of science or whatnot, and somebody comes and confronts you with this kind of talk. Well, hey, I've heard this. There's a study that shows, or studies that show, etc. How do you handle it? The way you handle it is, in this particular case, he can't just ignore it and walk away. Because he's opened the floor up to questions. What he can do, however, is just simply to put the burden of proof on her, because basically what she's done with this question is put the burden of proof on him. He has to prove to everybody that he's not a racist and that he's not promoting racism. Okay, so the way he puts the burden of proof back on her where it belongs is simple denial. It's by simply saying to her, there are no such studies. They just don't exist. And that cuts the legs out from underneath her confrontation. And then she's, of course, didn't come prepared, as the lefties never do. They don't give a damn about facts. If they have to, they just make it up. So she's not going to come prepared. So if you just simply say there are no studies you're talking about just don't exist, and go from there, and then pick on somebody else for the next question. You always have to put the left on the spot. They're the ones that have the burden of proof because they're the ones that always want change. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now from another example from Inspector Lewis of a lefty using trying to turn the tables on the professor by trying to get the professor to prove a negative. The lefty offers no proof of his own, and by just making things up as he goes along, he puts the professor on the spot. And again, the way for the professor to deal with this is to simply put the lefty on the spot by simply denying his arbitrary claims. Here we go.
Yes.
Professor Lipton, Senior Lecturer in Criminology and Fellow of Milton Hall. Professor Yelland, haven't we already seen how others use a similar tool? Cuba, for example, where the theory of criminal dangerousness has been misused to imprison people before they've actually done anything. Mostly, of course, opponents of the Cuban regime.
So again, there he puts the professor on the spot, and then everybody gives a big round of applause because it sounds like an unassailable argument. And it sounds that way because this professor that stood up didn't offer any proof or any evidence of what it is that he was talking about. So the proper way to handle that situation is with simple denial. No, the Cuban government doesn't do that. What you're describing does not happen in Cuba or anywhere else for that matter. Next question, boom, and you move on. And if you're confronted, of course, you're not a professor, I'm not a professor, but that's the kind of question you might hear. Well, what about Cuba? Doesn't Cuba do this? Or what about Venezuela? Or what about other governments? And why don't they do this, that, and the other thing? And the answer is no, they don't. Make them prove it. If the left is going to win, make them earn it. Now, the fear is always that, well, he might have some documents or some videotape or something like that he's going to present to you. Easy to deal with. You just simply say, what is this supposed to prove? And that's the end of his argument. He's done. He's finished. He's not going to like it, but that's too bad. If you're going to win again and you want to exercise power, it's not for sissies. The alternative is just simply to stay home, and whenever you do go out, you end up keeping your mouth shut because you're too scared to open your mouth and say anything. And that's what this is all about, really. Being a true conservative means that you're not afraid to go to work and say what you've got to say. You're not afraid because you have nothing to be afraid of, because you know that the left continually plays tricks. The left continually plays tricks, and so it's just a matter of figuring out what those tricks are and how to defeat them, and you can't lose. Back in a minute. Thank you. And yet a little bit more of Inspector Lewis. So later on in the same broadcast, it's the indelible stain. And after there's a little cocktail party after this guy has given his talk. And the woman, the second-year law student that had risen and asked him a question, is now talking to one of the employees at the place.
Would you like another glass? No, thank you. What did he think? Of what? His talk? Interesting. Well, interesting as in you think he has a point, or interesting as in how can someone so apparently clever be so apparently reactionary?
That's not for me to say.
Very loud an opinion, surely.
I'm just the department administrator, Miss Clemens. I leave opinions to those qualified to hold them.
Okay, so wrong. The way the woman handled it was wrong. Miss Simmons, or the girl that was the second-year law student or whatever, was the one that was asking, what do you think? Okay, and she's putting the other woman on the spot, because basically what she wants is for that other woman to, again, as she did, well, it was interesting. And so then she attacks that. And the whole idea is this is the way that the left gains adherence or shuts people up, because their motto is lead, follow, or get out of the way. Okay, so they want you to either agree with them, say, well, you were right. Oh, yeah, I heard you asking that question. Wow, you really had him going there, yeah, blah, blah, blah. Or you shut up and go away like what she did. There's another way you can handle it, and the way to do that is, again, put her on the spot. If somebody walks up to you and says, what did you think about this, that, or the other thing, particularly if it's something that is controversial or may prove to be controversial, one of the best things that you can do is say, you know what? I hadn't thought about it. What should I think? And let them tell you what it is that you're supposed to think. Let them, first of all, show their cards. Are they communists? Are they conservative? What? Okay, so you get to find out who they are. And you can put them on the spot and keep the pressure on them. So if they come back and say, well, what you should have thought was XYZ, you can say, really, how do you figure? Okay, and keep them talking, keep the pressure on the lefty. And that way you're not put in the position of having to, like what this lady did, well, I'm going to leave the opinions to those people that are qualified to have them. This lady was clearly intimidated, she was clearly scared, and she walked away. And she didn't have to be. Put the burden of proof on the lefties, watch them squirm for a change. Back in a minute.
Here's to the ones that we got. Cheers to the wish you were here, but you're not, 'cause the dreams bring back all the memories of everything we've been through. Close to the ones here today, close to the ones that we lost on the way, 'cause the dreams bring back all the memories, and the memories bring back you. There's a time that I remember when I did not know no pain, when I believed in forever and everything would stay the same. Now my heart feel like December. When somebody say your name, 'cause I can't reach out to call you, but I know I will one day, yeah. Everybody hurts sometimes, everybody hurts someday, yeah. But everything will be alright. Go with your voice and say, hey, here's to the ones that we got. Cheers to the wish you were here, but you're not, 'cause
This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. So I'm reminding you that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.